On the evening of March 11th, 2015, the Texas Death Chamber in Huntsville prepared for yet another execution. For decades, this red brick prison has been the final stop for the state's most notorious criminals, and tonight would be no different. Behind the heavy steel doors, guards escorted 46-year-old Manuel Vasquez, a man condemned for a crime that bore the unmistakable mark of one of the most violent prison gangs in America, the Mexican Mafia. As the sun dipped below the horizon, witnesses, journalists, relatives of the victim, and state officials filed into the small, sterile room separated by thick glass. Beyond that glass stood the gurney, with its thick leather straps stretched out like arms, waiting to embrace the condemned. Vasquez, pale and expressionless, was led in by officers who had rehearsed this procedure countless times. He was calm, almost resigned, as if he had been preparing for this moment for years. The ritual was precise. Vasquez was placed on the gurney, his wrists and ankles secured, his body immobilized. A chaplain offered last words of comfort, though it was unclear whether Vasquez accepted them. At exactly 6:15 p.m., prison officials began administering pentobarbital, the sedative used in executions across Texas. For the next several minutes, silence dominated the chamber. Onlookers leaned forward, watching the drug's effect as it coursed through Vasquez's veins. 17 minutes later, at 6:32 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Another name added to the long list of executions carried out in Huntsville. Another chapter closed, or so it seemed. But this was no ordinary case of capital punishment. The man on the gurney had not simply acted out of greed or rage. He was an enforcer, a soldier in a criminal army that stretches from prison cells to city streets. Vasquez was a hitman for the Mexican Mafia, also known as La M.I., a prison gang that dictates the flow of narcotics, taxes drug dealers under threat of death, and enforces loyalty with ruthless violence. His crime, committed nearly 2 decades earlier in 1998, was not a random killing. It was an order handed down from a gang boss and carried out with brutal efficiency. His victim was Juanita Ibarra, a 51-year-old San Antonio woman who failed to pay the gang's 10% dime tax on her drug sales. That failure would seal her fate. The state of Texas executed Manuel Vasquez for that murder, but his story, and Ibarra's, reveals a larger truth. This case exposes the power of the Mexican Mafia, the way it controls communities through intimidation, and the terrible price paid by those who defy it. How did a woman's refusal to pay a tax lead to her brutal death in a motel room? Who was Manuel Vasquez, the man who carried out the order? And why did the Mexican Mafia demand obedience at any cost? This is the story of power, fear, and murder by order of the Mexican Mafia. To understand why Juanita Ibarra was killed, you have to understand the shadowy system that ruled San Antonio's drug trade in the late 1990s. At 51 years old, Ibarra wasn't a cartel boss, nor was she a major trafficker. She was a small-time dealer, just one of hundreds trying to survive in the city's underground economy. But in that world, every dealer, no matter how small, was subject to the will of a much larger force, the Mexican Mafia. Known on the streets as La M.A., this gang had perfected a system of taxation that was as effective as it was brutal. They called it the dime, a 10% cut taken from all illegal drug sales. To the uninitiated, it may sound like a simple shakedown, but for those under its grip, the dime was law. Pay up and you could continue to operate. Refuse and you risked your life. The Mexican Mafia didn't have to send reminders. Their reputation was enough. Dealers knew the consequences. Those who didn't pay were beaten, shot, or strangled, their deaths serving as bloody warnings to everyone else. The message was always the same: defy us, and you will not live to regret it. For Juanita Ibarra, life was already difficult. She and her boyfriend, Moses Bazan, were barely scraping by. Drug sales provided money that helped keep a roof over their heads. But in 1998, Ibarra made a dangerous decision. She stopped paying the dime. Whether it was desperation, defiance, or simple miscalculation, that choice marked her for death. At the top of the chain was Rene Munoz, a gang boss who gave the order. To him, Ibarra's refusal wasn't just lost income, it was a challenge to the Mexican Mafia's authority. If one dealer got away with withholding payment, others might try the same. Munoz couldn't afford to let that happen. The organization thrived on fear, and fear required enforcement. That enforcement came in the form of Manuel Vasquez and two accomplices. Vasquez wasn't new to violence. He was already known as a trusted soldier, a man who would follow orders without hesitation. In the world of prison gangs, that kind of loyalty was currency. Carrying out Ibarra's murder wasn't just about discipline, it was about proving Vasquez's value to the organization. But at the heart of this story is the victim herself. Juanita Ibarra wasn't powerful, wasn't wealthy, and wasn't influential. She was a woman trapped in the pull of an underworld where survival required paying tribute to a gang that acted as judge, jury, and executioner. Her fate was sealed not because of personal betrayal or a vendetta, but because she failed to hand over 10% of her earnings, a debt that, in the eyes of the Mexican Mafia, was worth her life. This is the brutal logic of the dime. For the Mexican Mafia, it was never about the money alone, it was about control. And Juanita Ibarra's murder would soon become the ultimate example of what happens when that control is defied. It was 1998, a hot San Antonio night, when the order came down. Rene Munoz, the Mexican Mafia boss, had made his decision. Juanita Ibarra must die. To enforce that command, he dispatched 3 men, one of them Manuel Vasquez, already a trusted enforcer for La M.A. The target was simple, but the message was complex. This wasn't just about killing a woman who hadn't paid her tax, and it was about setting an example. Every dealer, every addict, and every rival needed to know. No one defied the Mexican Mafia without consequence. Ibarra and her boyfriend, Moses Bazan, were staying at a modest motel on the south side of San Antonio. For them, it was just another night in a cycle of hustling, selling, and surviving. But for Vasquez and his crew, it was the perfect hunting ground. They arrived with purpose, fueled not by personal hatred, but by obligation to a system that demanded obedience through violence. Inside that cramped motel room, the atmosphere shifted in an instant. The men forced their way in. What followed was brutal and methodical. Bazan was beaten savagely, fists and feet raining down until he was barely conscious. The sounds of the assault, thuds against the thin walls, muffled cries for help, went unnoticed in a place where violence was common and neighbors rarely interfered. Then came the moment that sealed Ibarra's fate. Vasquez, cold and deliberate, wrapped a telephone cord around her neck. In a world before cell phones dominated every pocket, the motel's landline became a weapon. Vasquez pulled tight, strangling her as his accomplices looked on. Ibarra struggled, fought for breath, clawed at the cord, but it was useless. Her life was extinguished in silence, her body left crumpled on the floor. For the Mexican Mafia, the mission was accomplished. To them, Ibarra was no longer a person, she was an example, a warning carved in fear. Her death was proof that Munoz's orders were absolute, that Vasquez and men like him were willing to kill without hesitation. But what the killers did not account for was survival. Moses Bazan, though battered and bloodied, clung to life. He would become the unexpected witness, the one voice capable of telling the world who had stormed that motel room and murdered Juanita Ibarra. The motel itself bore silent testimony to the crime. Bloodstains, broken furniture, and the lifeless body of a woman whose only crime was failing to pay her tax. Police arriving at the scene found the aftermath of gang enforcement at its most ruthless, a murder that felt less like a personal act and more like a business transaction completed in blood. This was the world Manuel Vasquez lived in. One where a woman's life could be traded for obedience, where a phone cord could become an executioner's tool, and where violence was the currency of power. When the killers stormed that San Antonio motel room, they believed they had eliminated every threat. Juanita Ibarra was dead, strangled with a telephone cord. Her boyfriend, Moses Bazan, was beaten nearly to death, left for dead beside her body. For Manuel Vasquez and his accomplices, the mission seemed complete. But in their brutal calculation, they overlooked one crucial detail. Bazan was still alive. Police arrived to find a chaotic crime scene. Blood smeared across the room, overturned furniture, and the lifeless form of Ibarra on the floor. Yet amidst the carnage, Bazan clung weakly to consciousness. Barely able to speak, he tried to form words, pointing investigators toward the truth. He was the only witness, the only person who could identify the men responsible. As Bazan recovered in the hospital, his story began to unfold. Piece by piece, he described the nightmare that had unfolded that night. The forced entry, the savage beating, the moment when Vasquez tightened the cord around Ibarra's throat. His account painted a chilling picture, one that law enforcement quickly recognized as more than just a random act of violence. This had all the markings of a Mexican Mafia hit. But for Bazan, telling that story came at a cost. Speaking out against La M was dangerous. The gang was notorious for silencing witnesses through intimidation, threats, or worse. In prison yards across Texas, their influence was absolute. On the streets, their reputation was just as fearsome. To testify meant putting a target on his back. Still, Bazan pressed forward. His testimony became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Without him, the state's ability to directly tie Vasquez to the crime might have crumbled. With him, they had a living witness who could look at Manuel Vasquez in court and declare, "That's the man who killed Juanita." For the defense, discrediting Bazan was the only hope. They pointed to his background, his involvement in drugs, his criminal lifestyle. But jurors saw something else. A man who had survived a gang execution attempt, bearing the scars and the trauma to prove it. His words carried the weight of lived experience. In the courtroom, every detail mattered. Bazan recalled the sound of Ibarra's gasps for air, the expression on Vasquez's face as he carried out the strangulation, the fear that gripped him as he realized they both had been marked for death. The jury listened, not just to the facts, but to the raw human suffering behind them. In the world of organized crime, silence is often enforced through terror. But in this case, survival gave one man the strength to speak. Moses Bazan's testimony would ensure that Juanita Ibarra's murder did not fade into obscurity. It would place Manuel Vasquez squarely in the crosshairs of justice and set him on the path to death row. By the time Manuel Vasquez stood trial, the case had already captured the attention of both law enforcement and the community. This wasn't just about one woman's murder. It was about confronting the reach of the Mexican Mafia, an organization that had turned San Antonio's streets into an extension of the prison yard. For prosecutors, convicting Vasquez was about more than justice for Juanita Ibarra. It was about sending a message that even La M's soldiers could be held accountable. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Jurors were selected carefully. Each one made aware that the case involved one of the most feared prison gangs in America. Security was heightened. Deputies filled the hallways, watchful for any sign of intimidation. For many onlookers, there was an unspoken question. Would fear of the Mexican Mafia follow these jurors home? At the center of it all was Moses Bazan, the survivor. His testimony had the power to make or break the case. Jurors watched as he recounted the horrific night in 1998, the forced entry into the motel room, the savage beating he endured, and the moment he saw Vasquez strangle Juanita with a telephone cord. His words were halting at times, heavy with emotion, but clear enough to leave no doubt. The prosecution built its case brick by brick. They presented the Mexican Mafia's system of dime taxation, showing how Ibarra's refusal to pay marked her for death. They explained how René Munoz, a high-ranking gang boss, had ordered the hit. And they showed that Vasquez was not just present, but the primary executioner, the man who carried out the strangulation himself. The defense tried to dismantle this narrative. They attacked Bazan's credibility, highlighting his criminal past and involvement in drugs. They argued that his memory could have been clouded by trauma or self-interest. But despite these efforts, Bazan's survival and his detailed account rang true. The physical evidence, the crime scene, the autopsy, the pattern of gang enforcement, aligned with his testimony. When it came time for deliberation, the jury had a stark choice: believe the survivor and hold Vasquez responsible, or cast doubt and risk letting a Mexican Mafia hitman walk free. It did not take long for them to reach a conclusion. The verdict: guilty of capital murder. For Manuel Vasquez, the outcome was final and devastating. The jury recommended the death penalty, sending him to death row in Texas. He was transferred to the Polunsky unit, where the state's most dangerous inmates await execution in solitary confinement. But beyond the legal outcome, the trial was symbolic. It demonstrated that even in the face of fear and intimidation, witnesses could stand up to organized crime. It proved that the Mexican Mafia's grip, though powerful, was not absolute. And it placed Manuel Vasquez firmly on the path that would end in Huntsville's death chamber nearly 2 decades later. The law had spoken. Vasquez was no longer just an enforcer for La M. He was a condemned man, awaiting the ultimate punishment for carrying out a murder ordered in the name of power and control. By 2015, Manuel Vasquez had spent nearly 17 years on Texas death row. Locked away in the Polunsky unit, he lived in near total isolation, 23 hours a day inside a small cell. His only constant companions, the concrete walls and the knowledge that one day the state would call his name. Appeals came and went. Lawyers argued for his life. But each legal maneuver only delayed the inevitable. His fate had been sealed the moment the jury returned its verdict. In early March of that year, Vasquez received the official notice. His execution date was set for March 11th. For condemned inmates, those final days are heavy with ritual. Meals are delivered, personal belongings are inventoried, and last visits are arranged. Some spend their time writing letters. Others read scripture or retreat into silence. Vasquez, by most accounts, was calm. He showed little outward fear, perhaps resigned after years of waiting for the inevitable. On the morning of his execution, he was transported from Polunsky to the Walls unit in Huntsville, home to Texas's death chamber. It's a place infamous in American criminal justice. Its red brick exterior and barred windows have been the last stop for more than 500 men and women since Texas reinstated the death penalty in 1982. Inside, the routine was clinical. efficient, and unchanging. As evening approached, witnesses began to gather. Reporters filled the press room. Relatives of Juanita Ibarra, the woman whose murder had set all of this in motion, arrived to witness what they believed would be justice. State officials checked their watches. The time drew near. At 6 p.m., Vasquez was led into the execution chamber. He wore a white prison uniform, his wrists and ankles shackled. Guards guided him onto the gurney, where thick leather straps bound him down, arms spread, feet secured, chest held firmly in place. The room was brightly lit, sterile, almost medical in appearance. A chaplain stood nearby, offering final prayers. Vasquez declined to make a lengthy final statement. He spoke only briefly, words that were neither an admission of guilt nor an apology, before falling silent. At 6:15 p.m., the warden gave the signal. A single dose of pentobarbital began flowing through the IV lines. Vasquez's body reacted almost immediately. His chest rose and fell heavily. His eyes flickered, then closed. For 17 minutes, the drug worked through his system. Witnesses described the scene as quiet, almost eerily so, until finally, at 6:32 p.m., Manuel Vasquez was pronounced dead. The man who once served as an executioner for the Mexican Mafia had now been executed by the state of Texas. His death closed the legal chapter, but it did not erase the memory of Juanita Ibarra, nor did it dismantle the violent network that had ordered her murder. In Huntsville that night, justice was carried out with clinical precision. But the question remains, did the death of one soldier truly weaken an army as powerful and ruthless as the Mexican Mafia? The story of Manuel Vasquez and Juanita Ibarra does not end with a lethal injection. It extends far beyond the walls of Texas's death chamber into the streets of San Antonio, the prisons of the Lone Star State, and the broader history of organized crime in America. Their story is both a cautionary tale and a mirror, reflecting the reach of a gang whose influence thrives on fear, loyalty, and violence. For Juanita Ibarra, the cost of defiance was her life. She was a small-time dealer, a person caught in a system she could neither escape nor fully understand. The Mexican Mafia's dime tax was more than a demand for money. It was a test of obedience. Those who refused were punished not with words, but with brutality. Ibarra's murder was designed to send a clear signal. Resistance to la M.I. would not be tolerated. Her death became a warning written in blood, echoing across neighborhoods, serving as a stark reminder of the power the gang wielded. For Manuel Vasquez, the execution marked the final chapter of a life defined by violence and loyalty to an organization that demanded obedience above all else. From the moment he joined the Mexican Mafia, he traded his freedom, morality, and ultimately his life for the temporary power that came from being an enforcer. In La M's hierarchy, he was valued for his willingness to kill, but in the end, the same system that empowered him could not protect him from justice. His story highlights the paradox of gang life. Strength and fear can elevate a soldier, but they cannot shield him from the law. Yet the Mexican Mafia did not die with Vasquez. The gang continues to operate in prisons and on the streets, enforcing its rules with intimidation, violence, and the ever-present dime tax. While law enforcement can remove individual members, the organization's structure ensures that others rise to take their place. The murder of Juanita Ibarra and the execution of Vasquez are chapters in a much larger narrative of control, crime, and punishment. A cycle that repeats, often claiming new victims along the way. The case also illustrates the resilience of witnesses and the importance of courage. Moses Bazan, the lone survivor, played a pivotal role in bringing Vasquez to justice. Without his testimony, the legal outcome may have been very different. It is a reminder that even in a world dominated by fear, one voice can challenge power, hold criminals accountable, and offer a measure of justice to victims who can no longer speak for themselves. In the end, the story of Manuel Vasquez and Juanita Ibarra is a study in power and consequence, loyalty and morality, fear and justice. It reminds us that organized crime is not just a series of headlines or statistics. It is a force that touches individual lives, shaping choices, ending lives, and leaving communities scarred. For Ibarra, justice was long delayed. For Vasquez, it arrived in a sterile chamber in Huntsville. But for all who examine this case, the lesson is clear. The cost of defying a violent system is high, and the consequences of participating in one can be just as fatal. The story remains a cautionary echo of power, obedience, and the human toll exacted by a gang that controls through fear, and the justice that follows when one man chooses to speak the truth.